Jeffery Dahmer's name has become synonymous with horror and depravity, and his crimes have shocked and horrified people around the world. He was responsible for the deaths of 17 young men, and his methods of murder and disposal of the bodies were truly gruesome. Serial killers have always fascinated and horrified us, and there are few as infamous as Jeffery Dahmer. His crimes were shocking, his methods were gruesome, and his name has become synonymous with evil. But what led this seemingly ordinary man down the path of violence and destruction? In today's video, we will explore the dark and twisted mind of Jeffery Dahmer and try to understand the motivations behind his heinous acts. So if you're brave enough, join us on this journey into the heart of darkness. Jeffery Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the first son of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His parents were both highly intelligent and ambitious, with his father holding a degree in chemistry and his mother working as a teletype machine instructor. However, despite their academic achievements, the Dahmers' marriage was far from happy. Lionel was a heavy drinker and frequently argued with Joyce, leading to a tense and unhappy home life. As a child, Jeffery Dahmer was described as shy and introverted, with few friends and little interest in socializing. However, he did show an early fascination with dead animals and would often collect roadkill and dissect it at home. This behavior worried his parents, but they dismissed it as a harmless phase and hoped he would grow out of it. As Dahmer grew older, his behavior became increasingly disturbing. He began to show signs of alcoholism and would often sneak drinks from his parents' liquor cabinet. He also became more isolated and withdrawn, spending hours in his room reading about death and murder. Dahmer's adolescence was marked by a series of troubling incidents. He was caught stealing from his neighbors and was arrested for indecent exposure after exposing himself to a group of women. He also struggled with his sexuality, feeling attracted to men but unable to come to terms with his feelings. As Dahmer's behavior became more erratic, his parents decided to send him to live with his grandmother in Ohio. However, this move did little to improve his mental state, and he continued to display signs of alcoholism and depression. When Dahmer was 18, his parents divorced, and he was left alone in the family home. This was when he began to act on his violent and disturbing fantasies. Jeffery Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, crimes were shocking and brutal, and his trial and eventual conviction captivated the nation. The murders of Jeffery Dahmer were a gruesome series of events that spanned over a decade. Dahmer's first known murder occurred when he was just 18 years old. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks and took him back to his parents' home, where he murdered him and dismembered his body. Over the next few years, Dahmer continued to commit increasingly heinous acts. He would lure young men to his home, drug them, strangle them, and then dismember their bodies. He would keep certain body parts as souvenirs and dispose of the rest. Dahmer's crimes went undetected for years, as he was able to manipulate the people around him and avoid suspicion. The arrest of Jeffery Dahmer was a dramatic moment in the history of criminal justice. After years of committing horrific crimes, Dahmer's reign of terror was finally brought to an end in July of 1991. It started when Dahmer's intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment. Edwards had been lured to Dahmer's home with the promise of money for posing for photographs. However, when he arrived, Dahmer drugged him and began to strangle him. Edwards fought back and managed to escape, running out into the street and flagging down a police car. When the police arrived, Edwards told them what had happened and led them back to Dahmer's apartment. What they found there shocked them to their core. There were body parts scattered throughout the apartment, and a foul odor filled the air. When they opened the refrigerator, they found several severed heads. Dahmer was taken into custody without incident. He initially tried to deny his crimes, but eventually he began to confess. He told the police about the murders he had committed and how he had dismembered and disposed of his victims' bodies. The investigation into Dahmer's crimes was extensive and grueling. The police had to identify the body parts found in his apartment, which involved painstakingly piecing together the remains of his victims. They also had to interview witnesses and gather evidence to build a case against him. Dahmer's trial was one of the most high-profile in American history. He was charged with 15 counts of murder and faced the possibility of the death penalty. However, He ultimately pleaded guilty but insane and was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences. The arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer was a watershed moment in the history of criminal justice. It showed that even the most heinous crimes could be solved, and that justice could be served for the victims and their families. Though Dahmer's crimes were shocking and horrific, his arrest and conviction helped to bring a sense of closure to those affected by his actions. The trial and sentencing of Jeffrey Dahmer were some of the most high-profile legal proceedings in American history. The Milwaukee Cannibal, as he was known, had been charged with 15 counts of murder and faced the possibility of the death penalty. The trial began in January of 1992 and lasted for 2 weeks. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence against Dahmer, including forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and Dahmer's own detailed confession to the murders. The defense, meanwhile, argued that Dahmer was not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that he suffered from a mental illness that made him unable to control his impulses. The trial was an emotional rollercoaster for everyone involved. The families of Dahmer's victims were present in the courtroom, and their grief and anger were palpable. At times, the testimony was so gruesome that some jurors had to leave the courtroom in tears. The prosecution argued that Dahmer had planned and executed his crimes with cold-blooded calculation. They presented evidence that he had kept souvenirs from his victims, including body parts and photographs, and that he had engaged in necrophilia with some of their remains. The defense, meanwhile, argued that Dahmer was a deeply disturbed individual who had been driven to commit his crimes by a combination of mental illness and childhood trauma. They presented testimony from psychiatrists and psychologists who had evaluated Dahmer and found evidence of several mental disorders, including borderline personality disorder and schizophrenia. In the end, the jury rejected Dahmer's insanity plea and found him guilty on all counts. During the sentencing phase of the trial, the families of Dahmer's victims were given the opportunity to address the court. Their testimony was heart-wrenching, and many spoke directly to Dahmer, telling him how he had destroyed their lives. The judge sentenced Dahmer to 15 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The sentencing was met with cheers and applause from the families of Dahmer's victims, who had finally received the justice they had been seeking for so long. The trial and sentencing of Jeffrey Dahmer were a defining moment in the history of American criminal justice. They showed that even the most heinous crimes could be punished, and that the voices of the victims and their families would always be heard. Though Dahmer's crimes were shocking and disturbing, his conviction and sentencing helped to bring a sense of closure to those affected by his actions. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was serving his time at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. He had been in prison for 3 years at that point, and had been attacked by other inmates on several occasions due to the heinous nature of his crimes. That morning, Dahmer was assigned to work detail in the prison gym with 2 other inmates, Christopher Scarver and Jesse Anderson. Scarver was a convicted murderer who had a history of violent outbursts and had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Anderson was a convicted kidnapper and armed robber. According to Scarver, he and Dahmer were left alone in the bathroom area of the gym, while Anderson went to retrieve some cleaning supplies. That's when Scarver says Dahmer made a provocative comment that set him off. "I looked into his eyes, and I saw nothing but evil," Scarver later told reporters. He said something like, "I messed up. I made mistakes." I looked at him and said, "You know, Jeff, you're going to hell." Scarver then grabbed a metal bar from the weight room and began attacking Dahmer, hitting him repeatedly in the head until he was dead. Anderson returned to find Scarver standing over Dahmer's body and called for help. Dahmer was pronounced dead at the scene, and a subsequent autopsy revealed that he had been bludgeoned to death. Scarver and Anderson were both charged with murder, but Scarver was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a mental institution. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer was a shocking and gruesome end to a life marked by horrific acts of violence and depravity. While some may argue that his death was a fitting punishment for his crimes, others may see it as a tragic and brutal reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human soul. A psychological analysis of Dahmer's life and actions reveals a complex and troubled individual who suffered from a variety of mental health issues. Dahmer's childhood was marked by a sense of isolation and detachment from others. He was a loner who struggled with social interactions and had few friends. He also exhibited troubling behavior, such as collecting dead animals and dissecting them, which may have been an early indication of his later violent tendencies. As Dahmer grew older, his isolation intensified, and he began to struggle with alcoholism and depression. He also began to experience disturbing fantasies about killing and dismembering other people, which he would eventually act out in horrific ways. Dahmer's crimes were motivated by a desire for control and a need to connect with others in an extremely perverse way. He would lure young men and boys to his apartment, where he would drug them and essay them before killing them and dismembering their bodies. The psychological root of Dahmer's behavior can be traced back to a deep-seated sense of shame and a need to control his own feelings of inadequacy. By exerting complete control over his victims, he was able to temporarily alleviate his own sense of powerlessness and insecurity. However, despite these psychological factors, Dahmer's actions cannot be excused or justified. His crimes were heinous, and he was responsible for the deaths of 17 young men and boys. In the end, the case of Jeffrey Dahmer serves as a stark reminder of the destructive power of mental illness and the importance of early intervention and treatment for those who are struggling with these issues. By identifying and addressing these problems early on, we can help prevent individuals from spiraling down a path of violence and destruction. In conclusion, the case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the most disturbing and chilling in the history of serial killers. His crimes were brutal and shocking, and they will forever leave a mark on the public's perception of such atrocities. Dahmer's story raises important questions about mental illness, the role of society in preventing such crimes, and the limits of human depravity. Despite the horror of his crimes, Dahmer's case also serves as a reminder of the importance of justice and the tireless efforts of law enforcement to protect society from such predators. And while we may never fully understand what drove Dahmer to commit such heinous acts, we can learn from his story and strive to prevent such tragedies from occurring in the future. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more of my content, please make sure to hit the like button and let us know which true crime story would you like for us to uncover next. Leave a comment below to tell us how you felt about the video. And if this is your first time here and you like true crime stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you'll never miss out on any of my future uploads. Thank you so much for watching.